Hey, Raptors, Mr. Lasser here. Hopefully, we can go ahead and get this thing started. Let me know if you can hear me. That's always the first thing that we need to figure out when we do this broadcast. So, I am hopefully audible. So, just give me a heads up if that is the case, and we will begin. All right. It looks like we're starting with somewhere around 20 folks here. So you can go ahead and start asking your questions. Thank you. So my volume is working good. We have the first question is actually one that I wanted to go over. And it's put forth by Simi, and Brandon has already started answering that question, and it's really good, not too far off there. So it's this term millenarianism. So in this unit, first of all, you can't really understand this term without really understanding kind of what's going on in this unit. We see, of course, in this unit the rise of the new imperialism, right? Imperialism 2.0, whatever you want to call it. And just like we saw with industrialization, there are reactions to these big changes that are going on. And one of the big reactions, or one of the reactions we see, are even like on the local levels of society. So the key concept says something along the lines of there were varied reactions to imperialism in the time period. I think it's, I'm trying to pull it up and see what the exact phrasing is of it. But some of these reactions were movements that were linked to some kind of religious belief, or belief that there would be a revolutionary societal change, right? This big change that's going to occur based on some action they do. And in this time period, we see a few really good examples of this that are very heavily connected to religion. And the first one, the one that we went over in class, was a reaction to British imperialism in South Africa with the Xhosa people, Xhosa. And they rejected the idea of being controlled by any imperial group, whether it was the Dutch or the British, but they had always opposed these people. And there had been a girl who had a vision that if the Xhosa people killed all their cattle and destroyed all their crops, the spirits of that they believed in would then drive out the British and usher in kind of a new era, a new time for the Xhosa people. Well, it didn't work, but it was seen as kind of this major change that if quite linked to religion. We see the same thing. Another example was the Ghost Dance. We see the Taiping Rebellion be another good example of this. Taiping Rebellion, with the leader of the Taiping Rebellion seeing stating that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. But these are some of the rebellions that are influenced by religious ideas, major rebellions that are backlash against imperial governments or imperial rule. And that term, specifically millenarianism, is the doctrine or belief in a future, usually like an imminent future, of like 1,000 years of blessedness, which is where you get that root word, like millenarian. Oftentimes it's linked to Christianity and ideas about Jesus, and oftentimes you see this like in cults and the like. But throughout history, there are several examples of this fight against imperial rulers. So that's pretty much it. For our part, we, for the most part, link it to some type of religious doctrine. Although, if you look up like millenarianism on Wikipedia, for example, like it'll give you a whole host of events that are linked to this. Close to like millenarianism is also something called millennialism, which is much more like of a Christian idea. So that's that. I probably wandered too long through that one. Question comes in, could you explain what economic imperialism is? Sure, certainly. So economic imperialism is just a reference to a form of imperialism that did not necessarily rely on political control of another region. So what do I mean by that? We got to think about like our base words, like politics, dealing with governments, economics, dealing with the movement of goods, the flow of goods, trade back and forth. So anything doing socially, right, or culturally, right? These are our themes. But the economic imperialism is when we see European nations and the United States especially exerting control over economically weaker governments. This is really well seen in like the banana republics of Central and South America. These places that were producing raw materials for major industrial powers and relying on trade with places like the United States and Great Britain. And often in these countries, there were very powerful companies or corporations that were not local. They were U.S. corporations, for example, in Central America. The United Fruit Company is the big example of this, and it will continue into our next time period. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the country itself, let's say the imperial power of the United States, was politically in control of Latin American countries. But because of our economic strength, we were able to dictate much of what happened to those countries, even to the point of making sure certain policies were set in favor of the United States. Britain was known for this as well. Britain is able to use their powerful economy and their powerful reach to end the slave trade. And while they didn't directly control Brazil, for example, they could put economic pressure on Brazil to change policies there. So that's what we mean by that term. Basically, if your powerful country can dictate what these lesser countries do through economic policy. All right. Please give examples of migrations that you will need for the test. Oh, I can do you one better. I can point you to the place where you'll find all the examples of migrations that you need for the test, and that is in the Period 5 key concepts. So if you take a look at key concepts, key concept 5.4, I'm just going to scan through it, and I'll start naming some that you need to know. So the first one that you examples. Now these are exemplars. You don't have to know every single example. If you know one of each type, you're probably pretty good. For one of the key concepts, it says, of course, new methods of transportation encouraged migration, of course, and it allowed for many migrants to return periodically or permanently to their home societies. And so examples of the return of migrants, you should know it. One of these, the Japanese agricultural workers in the Pacific that we looked at some images of, Lebanese merchants in the Americas, or Italian industrial workers in Argentina. So those are examples of migrants who would come over for work, sometimes seasonally, and then return home periodically or permanently. Many individuals chose to freely relocate. We talked about manual laborers and specialized professionals. You need to know about different types of coerced labor, indentured servitude, convict labor in Australia. With indentured servitude, specifically Chinese and Indian indentured servants in this time period. That's important. Of course, slavery, it continues into this time period into the mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century. So that is another example of migration, albeit forced migration, that you need to know. Other examples, if you just kind of have an idea of where people went, I talked about Chinese migrants. They migrated into Southeast Asia, all the way to the Caribbean, into South America, North America. Excuse me. A good example I gave you in North America was Chinese workers in the railroads of North America. South Asian Indians migrated to East and Southern Africa. Makes sense because that's where the British Empire was. The Caribbean, Southeast Asia as well. Oftentimes to work as agricultural labor. And other examples, let me think. Internal migrations that you need to know. The United States westward, often brought on by the gold rushes. That's one thing that we see. Another example would be migration into Siberia in Russia. But above all of this, the single migration you need to know is the migration to cities from rural areas. That sometimes happened internally, for example, in Great Britain, migration to cities at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but it also could happen between countries. We could have emigration from Europe to American cities, for example. So those are the big ones that I could ask you about. We'll be able to watch this later tonight. Yes, this video is available. So if in 15 minutes you just have to watch the Oscars, or if we go too long and you miss HQ trivia tonight, you can step away and go come back to this later. Next question: can you review the revolutions and important people involved? Why, certainly. Well, revolution is kind of a broad term. I'm going to assume that you mean the revolutions that are brought on by the Enlightenment rather than the Industrial Revolution. Pause for a second. This video, of course, is not yet sponsored by Coke Zero, but one day it will be, and we'll be making a lot of money. Anyways, big revolutions. So, the Enlightenment influenced many great big revolutions in this time period. The first that really comes to mind, or is the first revolution of the Enlightenment, is the United States fighting against Britain. Right, 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence is signed. Very much an Enlightenment document. The revolution had begun a year before, though. Important people to note. If you go back to we did Atlantic revolutions, or at least the Haitian, French, and American Revolution chart. That should have some of the major people to know. But I would say the American Revolution, your standards: Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Adams. You might see their names pop up. None of them are mentioned in the key concept by name. So if they come up, it will have some sort of information, some contextualizing information about them or about their writings. The next revolution, of course, is the French Revolution. The French Revolution was one of the most important events in European history. People to know from the French Revolution, the King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, they would be fine to know. Lafayette, Robespierre, who leads the Reign of Terror. Excuse me. Olympe de Gouges, the feminist philosopher who dies during the French Revolution, during the Terror. Napoleon, of course, who kind of wraps it all up with becoming dictator. The Latin American revolutions, there's a couple people know, but the big one is Simón Bolívar. He's mentioned directly in the key concepts. There's a few others: Jose San Martin, Argentinian leader. He's significant. The Haitian Revolution, you definitely need to know Toussaint Louverture as the Haitian revolutionary to know. And of course, I think that's kind of the big ones for the Atlantic revolutions. I don't want you to get too bogged down in each of these. There are a couple other revolutions that are mentioned, of course, in this unit. Um, for example, anti-imperial revolutions, the Marathas against the Mughals. I didn't touch on this too much. I think I may have brought it up in class once or twice. But as the Mughal Empire weakened, the Marathans, Marathans, they fight against the Mughals and eventually kind of create their own empire within South Asia. Of course, the British are coming in shortly after that, so it's kind of short-lived. Um, Anti-imperial rebellions or revolutions include the Sepoy Rebellion, otherwise known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Boxer Rebellion in China, the Taiping Rebellion in China. Those are the things I can think of off the top of my head. What I would say. All right. And I know that AP Worldopedia is not totally complete for this unit, but Freemanpedia on his site at the end of every unit has just like a list of important people to know. They're not all listed in the key concepts. You know how I stick close to that when I teach y'all, but if you kind of want an idea of people you might see quotes from or what have you, they're listed there. All right. Can you talk about the change in continuities of women's social status during the time period? Ooh, wow. That would be a great essay topic. Change in continuities in women's social status in the time period. Sure. Well, you put me on the spot, so I have to kind of think to myself about this. What things change for women and what things stay the same? So the first thing that comes to mind for me, I don't have this listed anywhere, so I wish I did, because then I could give you a better list. But the first thing for me that comes to mind when I think about changes for women is women entering the workplace during the Industrial Revolution, right? So we're going to see women working in factories, which is, of course, a great change for all of society. The fact that factory work takes place, but we see it in Britain, we see it in Europe as a whole, we see it in the United States. It's also something that we saw in those images of Meiji Japan, right? Women working in a silk factory. Now, women oftentimes would weave and do work in the home, but this is work outside of the home, which is pretty noteworthy. So opportunities as wage earners, in some cases, it's necessary for them to be wage earners because wages are so low for that sometimes the case, man, woman, and children have to go to work. But later on, of course, we know that changes. So that's one change I would say. The second big change that comes to mind for me is the rise of feminism in this time period as an offshoot of the Enlightenment. Remember that we had several women examples of the women's rights movement developing post 1750. Out of the Enlightenment, we see Mary Wollstonecraft, right? Olympe de Gouges. Mary Wollstonecraft writes, let me pull up the name of the document that we did not read it, but there is an example related to her. Mary Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she was known, if you had me last year, we read some quotes from Mary Wollstonecraft, and she actually writes back and forth, of course, with other Enlightenment thinkers, as the philosophes did, and chastises Rousseau for thinking that women could not do things equally to men. And so she very much pushes for women's equality. She says in one of her writings that she does not wish for women to be the master of men, but on equal footing, that women can do anything that men can do. Olympe de Gouges, Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, which we read, I think is especially noteworthy in this time period because she comes out of the French Revolution when these Enlightenment ideals are really taking hold, and she goes to push much further than maybe people were ready for in the next 150 years. She advocated for some of the things that don't come up again until the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And then, of course, in the United States, there is a convention at Seneca Falls in 1848, which further pushes for women's rights. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 pushes for women to get the right to vote, among other things, and other pushes for equality. But votes for women is the big thing. And that from that time in 1848 all the way until 1920, the women's rights movement is going to be pushing for that. So that's a big change that we see for women in this time period, kind of taking on this role with the development of modern feminism. Other changes that we see with women in this time period. Well, we do see a change of women taking more responsibility in the family in some cases with the migration of men. For example, in South Asia, we see women taking on greater roles in the family as South Asian men migrate other places for work. This is something that is kind of common. But we do see it in this time period. As far as continuities in women's social status during this time period, it's a patriarchal world coming at the beginning of this time period. It's a patriarchal world at the end. Women are still going to be seen as second-class citizens. For the most part, women do not receive the right to vote before 1900. In Britain, I'm going to look it up. Women are granted suffrage in about 1918. There are two laws passed, 1918, 1928. That's similar to in the United States, 1920 about. So it's going to be some time before women reach that status. That's a really good question. I'm going to keep thinking about it and hopefully be able to bring in a few more examples. I'm going to do a quick look through the key concepts. Specifically in the key concepts, it's listed in key concept 5.3, Roman numeral 4, the global spread of European political and social thought and the increasing number of rebellions stimulated new transnational ideologies and solidarities. And the example B is demands for women's suffrage and emergent feminism challenged political and gender hierarchies. So that's what is specifically mentioned in these key concepts. But really, really good question. I like it. It made me think. It's a good one. Thanks, Danielle. Lost my place. Do we have an SAQ tomorrow or just an LEQ Tuesday? No SAQ tomorrow. I think I can fit it in, but I just didn't feel like it this time. We've already done a couple. We did one of those a week or two ago, so we're just going to concentrate on the LEQ Tuesday. And I think I remember last year this test going long, so I'm going to just nix that and concentrate on multiple choice this time around. Good question. Did Adam Smith actually endorse capitalism or just write about it? So Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations. And when he is in his writings, he basically lays the groundwork for what will become capitalism. He argues that personal interest is what will drive the development of, or what will drive an economy the best, right? It's in the end, right? This personal selfish interest to do better for yourself. I think the example or the quote we had was the baker does not, or not the baker, the butcher does not do his work to feel better about himself or for the good of the community necessarily. He does it because he has to make money for his family. So that idea of kind of selfish or self-interest comes into play. It of course goes hand in hand with the idea that restrictions on trade should be lifted, and that people should be able to trade as much as possible. They should be able to own their private property, and that this would speed up the economy. Um, the Beyond that, I'm trying to think if there's anything. Let me see if there's anything else I could say about it. With the rise of capitalism, I mean that's a tough question. I think that's one that if I had Mr. Guilford here, he would probably be able to answer for us. That's more of, I think, on the AP Euro level. I think I can look in one place. This is my first stumper today, so congrats to you. Oh, now I lost the question. I'm confused. Some people claim he didn't actually advocate capitalism, but our book says he liked it. Yeah, I don't know. I've never heard that idea that he never actually advocates capitalism. It may just be that he advocates some of the foundational ideas for it. Yeah, I don't know whether he endorses it or not. Yeah, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, Daniel, you've stumped me. It is something that I will certainly be looking up once this is said and done. Yeah, I mean, you don't always have to agree with the philosophical things that you put forth, I guess. I don't know. We'll come back to that if we have time at the end, or maybe I'll just look it up tonight and I'll try to answer it better for you tomorrow. Let's keep going. What countries suffered from nationalist ideals? Ooh, well, that's an interesting way to phrase it. I don't know if we'd say suffered from nationalist ideals. And I'm not sure kind of where that question might be going. What I can say about it is we see the development of nationalism, especially first in France. Okay, so when we think about this idea of nationalism, right? People start to see commonalities between themselves and those like who aren't just like immediately around them, but are quite far from them, right? So what might be like within the borders of your country, right? This idea that there might be language or religion or customs or just physical location, right? Geography that linked people together. And of course, this becomes associated with kind of borders, natural borders or national borders. So this nationalism, of course, comes about first in France. It spreads, of course, across Europe. There are some specific examples. Actually, I was putting together a review for the AP exam, putting together my review PowerPoint and video for the AP exam on this. And I was looking at it earlier. There are a few examples that you need to know of nationalism or the growth of nationalism in this time period. The first is German nationalism. The German people start to see themselves as linked culturally, right? So we had Prussia and these like independent German states that resulted after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And they start to see themselves linked by language, linked by culture, linked by geography, and linked by their history, right? And so Germany will eventually coalesce into a single nation of Germans, right? Italy is another example of this. It had been broken up into the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Sardinia and Piedmont, I think, was one of the countries. The Papal States, part of northern Italy was controlled by Austria. And these Italians start to see themselves as Italian speakers, people with a shared history going back to the Romans, people with a common culture. Why should an Italian person be ruled over by an Austrian, right, who may not speak Italian? And so they start to coalesce, and through a series of wars, they eventually form an Italian nation. The Germans also, the Prussians, through a series of wars, also were able to unite Germany together, the Franco-Prussian War and the Austro-Prussian War. But there are other examples of this nationalism. Argentinian nationalism comes about, of course, as that's one of like the illustrative examples. You don't have to know every single one of these inside and out. I don't really do much with Argentina anymore, but this idea of a shared history, a shared language. They fought against the Spanish and they formed this country, and then they grow in this country. Argentina is a really good example of a South American country that industrializes, and so they have this national pride. Filipino nationalism. After the Spanish-American War, the United States takes over the Philippines, and they fight against the U.S. in a war that eventually comes out in the U.S.'s favor. But nevertheless, an idea of that shared Filipino nationalism, shared culture, shared history, shared language, geographic proximity to one another leads to this new national identity, which eventually, once the Philippines gets their independence, is seen even to this day. So it's tough to say that these countries are suffering. I wouldn't say they're suffering from nationalist ideals. Actually, they are. These national ideals actually are helping to create these countries in some way. Next question. All right. Can you review the Enlightenment thinkers we have to know? Certainly. So there's the thinkers and ideas that you need to know. And the first one that you need to know is John Locke. John Locke is the Enlightenment thinker who is probably, I don't know. His words are lifted by Jefferson. So he's the guy who talks about natural rights. John Locke believed that your natural rights are life, liberty, and property, right? The ability to own property. He also writes about what he calls not the social contract, that's a term used by Rousseau, the consent of the governed, right? This idea that the government's power comes from the people itself. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a second person that you need to know, really elaborates on this and says that the government and its people have formed a contract. The people give up some of their rights that they should have in a perfect society in order to keep the general peace, right? The government takes that role of making sure everything kind of functions smoothly. And in that case, you give up some of your rights. I can't go out and just do anything I want out in the world because in order to have an orderly society, we've all given up our some freedoms, right? But Rousseau also says if the government is not doing its job or are taking more rights than the people have given up, then that is breaking the social contract, and they have the right or the duty to rebel. So that's the second person. So Locke and Rousseau. The third person you need to know is Voltaire, the Stephen Colbert of his day. He was a satirist who wrote scathingly about church, the way the Catholic Church and governments worked together. And writing under a pen name, he was French. He advocates for religious toleration, among other things. And then the last one that you definitely 100% need to know is the Baron de Montesquieu, who wrote that the power of government can be boiled down to three things. It can be boiled down to making laws or legislating, enforcing laws, or the executive branch, and determining and interpreting the law, and the judicial powers. And so he advocates that those three powers should not be held by one single person or body, and that they should actually be separated. The separation of powers is what basically forms the foundation for the American Constitution. So these ideas really across these four thinkers are foundational for the American experiment of an Enlightenment style government. Of course, it's not perfect. The Enlightenment thinkers would probably say that as well. And after all, the Enlightenment was all about thinking and questioning and trying new things and figuring out how to use reason to correct some of the ills of society. But Separation of church and state, clearly an idea shared by Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers. The idea of the Declaration of Independence, we have natural rights, and that the British government broke the contract, and that we had the right to abolish that contract and create a new one. And of course, separation of powers found in the Constitution. Those are kind of those big Enlightenment era influences. All right. So those four: Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, Montesquieu. That's a lot to say, the four thinkers that you have to know. There are a few others that, of course, are important, but they're the ones out of the key concepts. What were some things that did not change due to global trade in the time period? So that's kind of broad the way it's phrased. I would say, if we're thinking things that don't change in global trade, we're still going to see, just like we saw in our last time period, the European nations dominating trade in this time period. That's the first thing I would say that really stands out in global trade. European countries, just like they had in the previous time period, will still dominate Indian Ocean trade, will still dominate the Atlantic system. Excuse me. There are still going to be certain commodities that are important for trade in this time period. Sugar will remain important in trade for a good portion of this time period. The first 100 years, slavery will still be occurring, so the slave trade will still be important coming into this time period. There will still be cotton will be another commodity, right? So there's still going to be certain commodities traded, although I guess cotton does rise in importance with the Industrial Revolution as a commodity. Those are the big ones off the top of my head. If it is, of course, if we go to the other part of that, the changes in global trade, well, there are many, right? Different countries enter in to this global trade. There are new commodities that come about, especially with the Industrial Revolution, that are needed to fuel that industrialism. New areas are linked into that global trade, especially more concretely, even, right? If we think about, for example, Africa. Africa was important for global trade, especially West Africa as a place to sell goods and a source for slaves. But in this time period, it's going to be more than just gold and slaves and ivory, right? We'll see the extraction of other resources like rubber or palm oil or whatever it might be. So, and a lot of other changes, political changes, especially in terms of the development of imperialism. Another change would be the speed at which trade can be done with the invention of the steamship. All right. Talk about colonialism in Oceania. I think that basically everything that I had on that, I said in class the other day. The British controlled it. Where's my notes, my excerpt that I literally read straight from it in class, thinking about Australia and New Zealand. The British began settling the region. There was a mix of British and free settlers and convict settlers in Oceania. In Australia, the Aborigine peoples, through disease and warfare, the Maori of New Zealand, their populations are devastated in favor of these European settlers, British settlers. In Australia, gold is discovered in the mid-1800s, which leads to an influx of settlers to the region. Also leads to the backlash with the White Australia policies that come into play. That's, for the most part, everything that you're expected to know dealing with Oceania in this time period. I'm real sorry to any Australians watching this, or any of you that have a family in Australia that you just don't have a larger role in uh, this unit. But we have to cut something, right? What were the Tanzimat form self-strengthening movements the only reform movements you need to know? No, not exactly. They are the most significant in terms of China and the Ottoman Empire, but they are not by any means the only reforms that you need to know, because we have to think about how many different types of reform there was, right? There were social reforms that come out of this time period. There were economic reforms. There are political reforms, right? With the that even result in revolution and the introduction of Enlightenment ideals. I think what you're getting at are perhaps industrial reforms that come out of this time period. And the Ottoman Empire and the Qing dynasty of China, those are two significant reforms that do meet resistance and really kind of fall short of all their goals. The Ottoman Tanzimat reform, much more successful than the self-strengthening movement was. But there are other reforms, for example, state-sponsored reform, Meiji Japan, right? The state, it pushes for industrial reform quite successfully, right? By the end of this time period, China has entered the world stage. Tsarist Russia, same thing. We see that they enact many reforms trying to industrialize, sponsored by the state. They build the Trans-Siberian Railway. They start building factories in Russia. This kind of hits a little hiccup as the Tsar of Russia is assassinated by an anarchist, naturally. And that leads to a more conservative reaction in Tsarist Russia. So they pull back from some of the reforms that they were making or attempting. Other reforms, off the top of my head, I can't think of any. Oh, well, rebellions, political reforms of following the Enlightenment I already mentioned. Yeah, so those are the big ones, I would say. So not just the Tanzimat and self-strengthening movement. No, those aren't the only ones that you need to know. There's certainly a larger variety of them. Oh, social reforms. That's what I was going to say. Sorry, I'm like clapping in my microphone. That's probably not pleasant for any. As a reaction to industrialization within industrial societies, remember that there are reforms undertaken which seek to change the conditions under which people work, and make and even the conditions of cities as a whole, right? So remember, workers organize into unions and they demand better wages, they demand shorter hours, they demand better working conditions. A lot of those reforms are achieved. So there are a lot of socialist reforms pushed that some countries meet, right? Countries like Germany and Great Britain are able to avoid socialist revolutions because they adapt along the way. They take in and incorporate some of these reforms into their policies. Britain's a great example of that. Germany, which forms the first welfare state, implements some of these reforms as well. Of course, then they ban, being a socialist, but that's what can you do? Other reforms, those are the ones off the top of my head. So I'll stop there because we have a lot more questions, and the Oscars have begun, which I haven't really seen many of the movies. So I hope Get Out wins the Best Picture though. What non-European countries other than the US, Japan, Russia engaged in imperialist activities? You are looking at that question from the name 54321. Excellent activity. And I think I said non-Western European countries on that. So forgive me if these two examples are Central European versus Western. I guess I got to rephrase that question. I know. So the big countries, of course, we know are like the Netherlands, Britain, France, right? Those are the big imperialist powers of Western Europe. Portugal and Spain, of course, their hold on their imperial powers weakens. But Germany, after it coalesces, and Italy, after it comes together, remember, they also join in the scramble for Africa. So they were also imperial powers. The US, Japan, Russia, those are some other big examples. But remember, the Ottomans are still an imperial power, albeit a shrinking one, right? They're one of the examples of losing control over their regions in this time period, a weakening Chinese imperial state as well. So, yeah, those are the big ones. The new kind of non-European ones that come on board here are the United States and Japan. The U.S. is at the very end of the time period, really. Of course, they had some economic sway in Latin America, but at the very end of this time period, winning the Spanish-American War, that's a big jump for the United States. Also incorporating buying Alaska and from Russia and annexing Hawaii too. Those are the other kind of big moments for the U.S. joining that imperial class of countries. I don't know what you'd call it. Most important trends and events in both the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire / British India. Okay. Most important trends and events. All right, let's start with the Ottoman Empire here. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, right? So the trend in the Ottoman Empire in this time period is they have gotten passed up by industrial Europe. Europeans and their use of modern weaponry and modern military strategy, they are able to kind of push the Ottomans around when Napoleon comes to Egypt in like 1798 or so. And that clues the Ottomans in that they have to really begin reform. And they start some reforms, but of course it's met with a lot of resistance within the Ottoman Empire as they try to modernize their military. This is especially among the Janissary class of this kind of old elite group. The Ottoman Empire then later on must continue to modernize, and they introduce the Tanzimat following a couple of losses, one of which being the loss of Greece during after the Greek War for Independence. And so they undertake reforms in between like 1830 and 1870-ish, the Tanzimat reforms. So I won't go back through the Tanzimat reforms again, but generally that is what happens. The Ottoman Empire then fights another big event in the 1850s, I want to say. Let me double check my date here. 1854, maybe? 1853 to 1856, they fight the Crimean War against the Russians. They receive assistance from France and Britain and a few others in their fight against the Russians to win the war. Of course, that clues the Russians in that they need to modernize, which is a whole other thing. But generally, the Ottomans in this time period are seeing themselves lose territory and get passed up. Their reforms are to try to make themselves more Western, more like the Europeans, especially more like the French. Let's see what else I'd say about the Ottomans. Yeah, that's my big stuff. With the other question you had was about not just the Ottomans, the Ottomans and the Mughal Empire, British India. So the Mughal Empire, again, another example of an empire weakening in this time period. The Marathas fight against them. eventually taking over kind of large chunks of what had been the Ottoman Empire, or excuse me, the Mughal Empire. I got to shift my thinking here. The British East India Company establishes a pretty good, or they establish rule over certain regions within India, usually through like agreements with like local leaders, local princes, and the like. But when the Indian soldiers of the British, known as the Sepoys, rebel against the British for a variety of reasons, that leads the British Empire to say, all right, British East India Company, you're not really doing your job. And they implement the British Raj, or the direct rule, the British reign, direct rule over India, which will last until 1947. The British Raj is seen as kind of the British taking a more, of course, it's a more direct rule over South Asia. And it's made possible by a lot of things, new technologies that come out of the second half of the Industrial Revolution, like telegraphs and steamships and the like. And they exert much greater control, especially economic control, over India during that time period. So that's off the top of my head the main stuff. I hope it was clear. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but it's been a long day. Can you review nationalism in specific countries like Germany and Italy? So I kind of dealt with that a little bit earlier. The use of nationalism to unite those regions. You don't need to look. You don't really know all the like the ins and outs, the very like intense specifics of what happened. Although I did put a video on your homework calendar. Let me double check and make sure I did. That looks at the unification of Germany and Italy. And if you go to that, and I can tell you what day I put it on the calendar. There's a video from last year that you may remember watching or may not remember watching. It was in a challenge focus area, I believe. And European national unification. There's a reading on it. And then a 19th century revolutions video as well, which I think might kind of cover some of that same stuff. So what's in that is basically what you need to know. But just know that this new idea of nationalism unites people together and helps these countries develop into like a unified nation state within the borders. When are we going to have PLT next week? Well, not Monday. You'll probably we'll wait till the next Monday since you don't have a chapter due this week. If you want to take any other assessments, you can come in during my office hours or get a pass from me. Oh, we have enough time for the LEQ with the food truck rodeo on Tuesday. I believe so. Someone just turned your Lambo on. I don't get that. I don't know what that means. So somebody's gonna have to explain that one to me. You can type that in the comments below. You may have been hearing my dishwasher or washing machine or something. What strategies did the Ethiopians use to defeat the Italians, even though the Italians had superior weapons and technology? Ooh, deep cut. This is much talked about in much more detail in our other book, our old book for this unit, that talks about the Ethiopians. Basically, the Ethiopians developed industry to the certain extent that they could create like their own weapons. They didn't rely on Europeans necessarily to create the weapons to fight against Europeans. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I'm gonna have to move my computer, and it's gonna be kind of really awkward. So sorry about this. And I'll see if I can locate it really quickly. I seem to recall like an image, a specific image of a gigantic cannon that they created. So if I can find out where it went, I could show you an image of this thing. So just stick with me here. This is kind of a funny moment in history. Let's see. Page 701, yeah. So our old book has some fun stuff. Yeah, so Ethiopia is able to undertake some modernizing reforms, similar to how Egypt did under the ruler Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, the ruler of Egypt. Egypt is able to institute some modernizing reforms following the arrival of Napoleon as well. But so state building and reform are also underway in Christian Ethiopia. This is the words of Bulliet, who is the writer of our old book. Beginning in the 1840s, Ethiopian rulers purchased modern weapons from European sources and created strong armies loyal to their ruler, Emperor Tewodros. And he encouraged the manufacture of weapons locally. Let's see. Some kind of craziness ensues. He asks the British to come help, and then they invade. The leader commits suicide to avoid being taken prisoner. But the British eventually withdraw from Ethiopia, and Tewodros's successor, Johannes, continued to expand Ethiopian imperial rule. Eventually, when the Italians attempted to establish a protectorate over Ethiopia, they found the Ethiopians armed with thousands of rifles and even machine gun and artillery pieces. Although Italy sent 20,000 troops to attack Ethiopia in 1896, they were defeated by a larger and better trained Ethiopian army. Wow, what a great walk down memory lane from the Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. Great book. Great book. Good question, Jose. Clarification on an earlier question, maybe what countries are harmed or suffered due to the rise of nationalist ideas. A lot in our next time period. Depending, yes, definitely. What were the modes of the spread of industrial revolution, especially to Russia and Eastern Europe? So for that, I'm guessing that you're thinking about, like, how does industrialization spread there? Like, how do they get the stuff? And for the most part, industrialization spreads with learning from countries that are already doing it, bringing in people who are skilled or know how those things work, and then asking them to build the same type of stuff in your country. I don't know, kind of beyond that, what we would say the modes are. There are certainly some things that come about that, like, signal for countries that they need to industrialize. And in Russia, it was, of course, seeing European powers overtake them, knowing they had to modernize the military when Napoleon invades, knowing they have to create a larger industrial economy after the defeat in the Crimean War. So those countries in general, what happens, I can't say this is exactly what happened in Russia because I just don't have that knowledge. Feel free to look it up on your own. They would bring people in from these other countries. They would hire the industrial capitalists to come in and show them how to do these things, borrowing the knowledge from places that were already doing it and doing it well. Japan's a good example of that, right? Meiji Japan just, all right, teach us how to do it and we'll do it ourselves. What were the Latin American Revolution a collection of smaller revolutions? Were they connected to the Jamaican Revolution? So I don't really know much about the Jamaican Revolution. I can't really say much about that. But yes, the Latin American revolutions are generally smaller. It is not one single big revolution. You have the Mexican Revolution, the the South American revolutions are kind of two groups at the same time. Um, the Simon Bolivar in the northern part of South America in Colombia, Jose de San Martin in southern Latin America, Argentina, and they basically meet. Actually, there's a really famous like painting of Bolivar and Martin meeting. You just search Bolivar and San Martin meeting uh, in Google. You can find the images. The Guayaquil Conference, and these two. It's kind of shown again and again in different imagery throughout history. There are all sorts of things. Basically, the armies kind of march and meet kind of in the middle after defeating the Spanish, and then marching kind of toward the coast. I think under Bolivar's command at that point. So yes and no, right? They are a collection of smaller revolutions, but there are times when they combine or they overlap in terms of when they're taking place. All right. I'm the only person who would call an assassination a hiccup. Maybe. Yeah, that is true. Let's see. Would Belgium be considered a country that engaged in imperialist movements? Well, Belgium certainly was an imperialist country. They were an industrial country too. Remember that they are really the first country outside of Great Britain to industrialize. The Belgians, certainly known for that. They also kick off the scramble for Africa as King Leopold sends his men into the Congo to establish relations with people along the Congo River in order to extract rubber from Africa. And European nations, remember, not wanting war, wanting to maintain a balance of power in Europe, decide that the best way forward is to avoid general warfare over this rich continent of resources of Africa. The best thing to do is to just meet and divide it up without Africans present. And that's the Berlin Conference that occurs in 1870-ish. And Belgium gets to keep the Congo as a result. All right, last question. That looks like it's popped up here. A lot of you probably are over it. We've been talking. I've been talking for about an hour, so I know it gets tiring. What are some examples of migrants that were specialized professionals? Ooh, geez. With that term, I think we are referring to skilled workers. So any, it could be anything from someone who builds machines to running machines to a skilled carpenter to masons. Off the top of my head, let me. That's the ones that kind of come to mind. I don't think that the key concept is looking for like a specific group of people that did a particular skill. But I could give you, I guess we could say like Chinese were migrants who specialize in building railroads, right? That could be one specifically. I think they're trying to, in the key concepts, that use of term specialized labor, they are trying to differentiate from just people who are going to work in farms and do that kind of just general manual labor and manual agricultural labor. I think that's really what we're looking at. So believe me, you won't get an essay just on that one specific topic. That would be a general example to give of examples of migration. All right. Well, why are there so viewers on live streaming? I don't know. Oscar is coming up. I think also a lot of people know this unit pretty well. This is something that don't psych yourself out. There is a lot in this unit. There's a bunch of information here. We cover industrialization. We cover imperialism. We cover revolution. We cover migration. We cover nationalism, right? There's all that stuff in between. But it's stuff that last year we spent about 2 or 3 months on. So you know, it's a lot of the stuff that um, about industrialization, for example. I mean, you know that. You guys know that stuff already. So trust your gut on the test. Who do I think will win Best Picture? I'm going with Get Out because that movie is great. Plus, I think it might be the only movie I've seen that's up for Best Picture, unless if Wonder Woman's up for Best Picture, I would go with that. Maybe that was a good one. Black Panther is it up for maybe next year? What a great film. All right, that's all, folks. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Feel free to ask me questions in the morning if you can find me. Thanks. Bye.